I didn't catch the alarm going off this time. It just pulsed red on my HUD, flashing silently as if even sound had finally surrendered to the Nurixi. I couldn't remember the last time it was quiet. The Citadel's corridors were lined with layers of steel and circuitry, every inch packed with technology to withstand a galaxy's worth of wrath, and yet here I was, barely able to hear my own thoughts. I checked my neural dampener. Its thin green light flickered erratically. Damned thing. When these devices were first issued, Command sold them as a silver bullet against the Nurixi's mind tricks. But ever since the nanites flooded the Citadel, even our best tech struggled to hold back their influence. It was like being neck-deep in a mire, the weight of their presence sinking into my mind. "Captain, we're losing the east perimeter shields," came a voice over the comms. "Private Anders." New kid, green as they came, but he hadn't broken yet. The voice held a thin veneer of calm, but I could feel the fear in his pauses. I glanced over at my team. We'd been stationed here for hours now, positioned as a final line of defense. Each of them wore the same haunted look, expressions fixed into grim masks under their helmets. Dark jokes passed between them, little fragments of gallows humor as they tried to smother their terror. Anders had started calling his neural dampener his mind leash, cracking jokes that it kept his thoughts on a tighter leash than the Citadel's prison cells. But no one laughed today. I triggered the HUD map and watched as the defensive lines blinked out, one by one, like dying stars. They were already past our outer perimeter. If the Nurixi reached the Citadel's core, it would be over. Earth would have no warning. This wasn't just a fortress. It was the final warning bell for humanity, and it was crumbling fast. We moved out, navigating corridors that should have felt familiar. Instead, they seemed to shift, each turn warping in my peripheral vision. The Citadel had once been the epitome of design, a marvel of function over form. Now it felt like an endless trap, as if the walls themselves were mocking our arrogance. I saw Private Anders stumble ahead of me. He froze, mouth opening to speak, but the words never came. Instead, he just stopped. His face twisted, not in pain, but confusion. His features drooping like they were melting. I reached out, grabbing his shoulder and pulling him back. As he turned, his face snapped back to its usual form, but there was a hollow look in his eyes, a void where certainty used to be. "What did you see, Anders?" I asked, though I knew he wouldn't have an answer. He didn't, just shook his head. "Sir, I thought I saw—" He broke off, staring at the wall, his gaze unfocused. "Never mind." This wasn't our first encounter with the Nurixi's nanite fields, but something felt different this time. I'd seen them alter the course of bullets, twist reality just slightly enough to make us question ourselves. But this was bolder. They were toying with us, pushing further than they'd ever dared. The first sign of them was a strange dimming, a thickening of the air, as if shadows had weight. From the corner of my eye, I saw a roiling shape, a mass of shifting particles wrapped in a shroud. The Nurixi never appeared clearly. They existed as moving blurs cloaked by clouds of nanites that distorted their true forms. I raised my rifle, thumbed the safety off. We opened fire. Bullets tore through the air, ripping into the nanite cloud. The shadow shifted, as if startled, but it didn't retreat. Instead, our rounds twisted, bending mid-air, skidding away in arcs. Private Meyer cursed beside me, unloading his rifle in a burst of panic. The bullets did nothing. They spiraled around the creature and ricocheted off the walls. The Nurixi surged forward, nanites spreading in a thin fog. They weren't attacking us, not directly. The fog crept toward the walls, merging with the circuitry. I realized too late what was happening. They weren't fighting to kill us. They were already past us, past our defenses, infiltrating the Citadel itself. My neural dampener buzzed violently. A surge of images forced their way into my mind, faces I recognized, soldiers I'd lost, some of them long gone. My brain felt like it was seizing under the pressure. I saw the faces of comrades twisting, morphing, expressions of horror frozen on faces that should have been dead and buried. These weren't memories. They were the Nerixi's way of invading me. I forced myself to look away, pulling out a chronoplasm grenade and arming it. The small, thrumming device was supposed to create a localized bubble where time behaved predictably. At least, that was the theory. I hurled the grenade forward, watching as it detonated. Instead of the expected steady hum of controlled time, there was a crackle, like the beat of a heart skipping. The air thickened, time warped around us, the walls and corridors rippling in slow-motion waves before snapping back to a semblance of normal. But even as the burst settled, the Nerixi stood unmoved. They didn't so much as twitch. I tried to hold the line, but the retreat dissolved into chaos, soldiers scattering in every direction without formation or logic. This wasn't a retreat, it was a panicked scramble, men running from something that tore apart every law, every rule we thought we knew. Back at a safer position, I took stock of our numbers. Half the squad was missing, scattered in the chaos, and I didn't trust myself to remember their faces. When I tried to recall who I'd started with, their names shifted in my mind, as if erased by an unseen hand. Anders was still there, breathing hard. His hand shook as he reloaded, the movements frantic and disjointed. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. "Sir, what the hell are we even fighting anymore?" I didn't know either. This was supposed to be a war, and wars had rules, a code, even if it was unspoken. But the Nerixi were rewriting the rules, slipping into our heads, twisting reality itself. I wondered briefly if we'd already lost, if this retreat was nothing more than a prelude to surrender. As we made our way to the fallback point, Anders muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. "You think they've already won, sir?" I didn't answer him, just kept moving forward, gun raised, one eye on the corridors and the other on my own sanity, both of which felt like they were slipping. We barely had time to catch our breath at the fallback point before command's orders came through again, static buzzing in my ear. They needed us to regroup with a new squad and press forward. The Citadel's eastern front had gone dark, defenses lost. We were to retake it, at all costs. My mind still spun from the nanite field, and I forced myself to take stock, grounding myself in the tangible. I ran a systems check on my neural dampener, half expecting it to fail outright. But the device hummed back into stability. It was little comfort. Anders and Private Meyer were still with me, as shaken as I was. Meyer had been with me for years. We'd survived the first waves of Nerixi incursions together, the kind of man I trusted implicitly. Or at least, I thought I had. Now, as he checked his rifle, I caught myself staring, studying his movements for any hint of oddity. Just the thought felt foreign, like it had been planted in my mind. The Nerixi had started to push their influence deeper, twisting not just our defenses but the fabric of trust. Out of nowhere, I had a memory of a past mission with Meyer, only different. We'd been in a firefight, pinned down behind the ruins of a downed transport. He was covering me. I could see him reloading, could feel the heat of the muzzle flashes, only he hadn't been there. It had been another soldier entirely. This memory had shifted, slotted Meyer into a place he'd never been. My head throbbed. The memory felt real, but it was wrong. The Nerixi's reach had slipped further into my mind than I'd realized. I clenched my fists, fighting to hold on to something solid, but the past slipped and twisted like oil on water. I glanced at Meyer again, catching him looking back, a wary glint in his eye. He probably thought I was just as off. "Everyone's jumpy, sir," he muttered, checking his HUD. "No one can trust anything in this goddamn place anymore." "Eyes forward," I ordered, voice tight. "Keep your dampeners checked and your focus tight. We're all we have out here." But in my head, the distrust was already spreading, like cracks along a wall I couldn't repair. As we moved into position, we encountered the new team, already gathered in the choke point outside the eastern perimeter. They were led by Sergeant Fields, an older soldier with a face I recognized from years back. He looked tired, skin drawn tight over his cheekbones, and his eyes had a lifeless quality, as if he'd been staring at something far off for too long. "Captain," Fields greeted me with a slight nod, his voice stiff. "Heard you had a rough run-in with the shadows." "Nothing we couldn't handle," I replied. Fields' team was a mix of veterans and fresh recruits. They wore the same expressions, that haunted look that came from staring too long into the abyss. They were huddled close, speaking in low voices, exchanging dark humor like talismans against the horror closing in on us. One of them, a private named Lang, was laughing as he loaded his rifle, a laugh that was more of a desperate bark than anything. "I hear the Nurixi have a way of making you feel like you're watching yourself from 10 feet away," Lang muttered to his partner. "Like they're piloting you from some damned control panel." There was something off about the way he said it. The same line of gallows humor we all used, yet it carried an edge that didn't sit right with me. My skin prickled, and I was caught in a web of second-guessing every word, every glance. Our teams fell in line, forming a staggered patrol through the corridor, phase shields at the ready. Maya walked beside me, eyes scanning our surroundings, but his face remained inscrutable. We advanced in grim silence until I finally heard Fields mutter, "Something wrong, Captain? You're looking at me like I've grown a second head." I forced myself to respond, stifling the paranoia. "Nothing, Sergeant. Just a long day." The truth was, my trust was fraying. I could feel it in the way I eyed each of them, looking for signs of Nurixi manipulation. And I hated it. The Citadel was supposed to be the last bastion where every soldier had each other's back. But here I was, questioning the loyalty of men I'd fought beside for years. The Nurixi had planted doubt in my head, and it was spreading like a disease. We were halfway to the perimeter line when my HUD began glitching, casting brief, distorted images that made my pulse spike. Faces flickered in and out, familiar yet wrong. Anders' face, twisted and slack, looking more like a corpse than a living man. I blinked, shaking my head, but the image lingered. "Sir, my HUD's bugging out," Anders said, his voice tight with panic. "Check your systems," I said. "Stay focused." But the malfunctions only worsened. My neural dampener pulsed, sending out shocks that scrambled my thoughts. I felt as if I was phasing in and out of reality, drifting between memories and the present, past and future colliding. Ahead, Sergeant Fields halted, raising his fist to signal a stop, and for a moment I saw his face shift. One moment it was Fields. The next it was a young soldier I'd seen die months ago, his eyes wide and empty, lips twisted in a frozen scream. Fields glanced back, his face back to normal, but my hands tightened on my rifle. I couldn't trust what I was seeing. We pressed on, but my senses were frayed, battered by images that made no sense. It felt like I was swimming through a thick fog, each step dragging me deeper into a reality I could barely recognize. As we neared the defensive line, we finally spotted movement ahead. Nurixi shadows moving in eerie silence, drifting through the defenses as if they owned the place. "Engage!" I commanded, and my team opened fire. We moved in a practiced formation, our bullets arcing toward the shifting figures, but the Nurixi twisted out of range, their nanite clouds deflecting our rounds. A flash of movement to my left caught my eye, and I turned, catching Maya's silhouette. But his eyes were blank, mouth moving as if he were trying to speak, yet no sound emerged. He opened fire on our own men. Bullets cut through the air, ricocheting off armor, and I shouted for him to stop. My voice was lost in the chaos, drowned in the screams and the shriek of metal as our own defenses turned against us. I couldn't get to Maya in time. He was tearing through Fields' team, his expression blank as though he were possessed. I tackled him to the ground, wresting his rifle away. He blinked, his eyes clearing, but his confusion mirrored my own. "Sir, I don't remember." His voice trembled, his hand reaching out as if to touch something invisible. "I don't remember why I did that." "They're in your head, Maya," I whispered, the horror sinking in. I let him go and he slumped, clutching his head as though trying to squeeze the alien influence out by force. Our mission was already a failure. Half the team was dead or incapacitated, and I was left with Anders, Maya, and Fields. We retreated from the defensive line, regrouping back in the main corridor as I tried to gather my thoughts. The citadel was compromised, defenses crumbling before my eyes. I glanced at the survivors. Maya was broken, staring vacantly at his hands as though afraid of what they might do next. Anders stood nearby, tense and pale, his weapon clutched too tightly. Fields was watching me, a mixture of mistrust and fear in his gaze. We were all on edge, each of us questioning not only our orders, but our own minds. "We're pulling back," I said finally, gripping my rifle with shaking hands. "Command has to know the eastern line is gone." Fields stared at me, his mouth twisting in distaste. "Pulling back? We're supposed to hold this position, Captain. You're just going to leave it to them?" I could see the desperation in his face, the fierce need to believe we could somehow still win this. But I knew better. I'd seen the way the Nurixi moved, how they bypassed our defenses like they were playing a game. We'd been outmaneuvered from the start. "We're leaving," I repeated, voice harder. "They're in our heads, Fields. You saw it. Maya's lost. I'm not risking any more of us to this." Fields didn't respond, just turned away, his shoulders slumping in resignation. But as I watched him, a sickening thought wormed into my mind, the same one that had plagued me all day. What if this retreat was exactly what the Nurixi wanted? As we made our way down the corridors, I glanced back at Maya, at Fields, and finally at Anders, each of them bearing expressions that seemed both familiar and alien. I had the chilling sensation that I wasn't leading men, but ghosts, shades of people I thought I knew, each of them harboring secrets I'd never understand. And then a thought struck me, a revelation that turned my blood to ice. If the Nurixi had infiltrated our memories, then maybe this was all part of their design. Maybe every step, every order, every death was another move on a board I couldn't even see. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were pieces, pawns in a game with no rules, led along by invisible hands toward an end I couldn't even begin to imagine. The lights in the corridor dimmed, then flared up again. My neural dampener buzzed against my skull like a hornet trapped inside my helmet. My HUD flickered, shifting between its normal display and something else. Coordinates twisted, status updates blinked out mid-sentence, and the walls around me seemed to breathe, the metal panels bending and warping. The citadel, our fortress, had turned against us. Hallways led nowhere or looped back into themselves. We walked a stretch of corridor only to end up where we started, as if we were trudging through an infinite maze. Walls that should have been solid shimmered, then shifted, revealing unfamiliar rooms that didn't belong in this sector. Everything felt off, like the laws of reality were being peeled back. Private Maya stumbled forward, his helmet partially unlatched, his face streaked with sweat. He was mumbling, repeating something I couldn't make out. I caught him by the shoulder, forcing him to look at me. "Maya, snap out of it." "Captain, they're everywhere. They're inside me, inside all of us." He gestured around. "You can see it too, right?" I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I could feel the Nurixi in my thoughts, like cold fingers tracing the inside of my skull. They were prying at the edges of my memories, twisting them, and I was losing track of what I knew to be true. My first mission, my old squad, even my own name felt uncertain, slipping through my mind like smoke. We pressed on, stepping through shadows that coiled around us like they had weight. Maya was right beside me, but I could feel his mind slipping, the once clear connection between us distorted. I tried to focus, tried to cling to anything that felt real, but it was like grasping at water. Further ahead, I saw faces I hadn't seen in years, soldiers I'd lost, comrades who'd fallen in the first Nurixi incursions. They were lined up along the walls, staring at me with empty, accusing eyes. My mind had snapped a tether, and fragments of memories I didn't recognize flooded me. I was in a different place. A sunlit street far from the citadel, far from any battlefield. I was home. There was laughter, familiar voices, faces filled with warmth and trust. A family. I remembered them, though I couldn't picture them. I felt the ache of a life that had been ripped from me, a life that had been mine. The memory slipped away as quickly as it had come, leaving me cold and empty. Had I ever had a family? I'd never thought about it before. In fact, I couldn't remember ever thinking of anything outside of duty, outside of this war. My entire existence had been stripped down to following orders, defending the citadel. But now, I was no longer sure if that life was real or just another fabrication, another manipulation by the Nurixi. A surge of anger broke through the haze, sudden and blinding. It was rage against the Nurixi, against whatever they'd done to me, against the fragments of a life I couldn't remember if I'd ever lived. I gritted my teeth, my hands shaking on my rifle. They'd wormed their way into my memories, twisted them, and for what? Control? Manipulation? Was my entire life nothing more than a cruel game they played? My neural dampener buzzed again, and I was back in the corridor, my team staring at me, confusion in their eyes. They didn't see what I'd seen. They hadn't heard the laughter or felt the warmth of faces they couldn't quite place. But I had a new certainty, a dark realization settling. The Nurixi were warping reality to isolate us, disorient us, make us doubt what was real. I felt an almost hysterical urge to laugh, but I held it back. The citadel, our defenses, even our memories, they were breaking these down piece by piece, not with brute force, but by twisting our minds. We were fighting an enemy that wasn't just trying to kill us, but to make us unravel, turning our last stronghold into a trap of their own design. I came to a sudden decision. I knew what had to be done. The citadel itself was compromised. There was no point in defending a place that had already fallen, not just physically, but mentally. This fortress had been twisted by the Nurixi, turned into a trap that consumed us. "We're leaving," I said. "The citadel is done. We have to destroy it." Anders and Maya stared at me, shock and disbelief warring in their expressions. Anders opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. "Look around you. This isn't a fortress anymore. It's a prison. Every second we stay here, they pull us deeper into their control. We blow the core and we take this entire place down with them." Field's face twisted with something close to betrayal. "This place is our last defense. You're talking about blowing up the last thing humanity has?" I looked at him, expression hard. "We don't even know if humanity still exists out there, Fields. For all we know, we're the last echoes of a war they've already won. You want to keep fighting here? Fine. But this fortress isn't a sanctuary. It's a tomb." There was silence, then a grudging nod from Fields. He knew I was right, even if he couldn't accept it. One by one, the others nodded too. If there was even a shred of autonomy left in us, we'd reclaim it with one last defiant act. We'd take the citadel down on our terms. As we made our way to the core, I felt a calm settle over me. It was as if the fear, the doubts, had been stripped away. All that remained was this singular purpose. I set the charges myself, methodical and precise, feeling each click and snap as the explosive units latched into place. My hands didn't tremble and the calm almost disturbed me. There should have been more resistance. Someone from command should have stopped us. But there was nothing. Only silence, a thick, choking quiet that left us utterly alone. The others watched as I armed the detonator, expressions carved into masks of grim acceptance. Even Maya, lost as he was, had a strange look of determination in his eyes, like he was ready for this finality. I set the timer to 10 minutes. It was enough to get us out, if the corridors didn't twist on us again. My thumb pressed down on the timer, and the countdown began. I took one last look at the core, at the walls I'd known better than my own skin. The citadel had been my home, my purpose, but now it was a husk, a trap. Destroying it was severing my last tie to any semblance of safety, of stability. This place was no longer our shield. It had become our cage. As we turned to leave, a wave of pressure suddenly surged in the air, pressing into my mind. The temperature plummeted, and I felt the edges of my thoughts scrape against something sharp, invasive. The Nurixi were here, though not in any form I could see. Instead, they slipped into my mind like knives, twisting, pressing at my fears and doubts. A barrage of images flooded my thoughts, visions of us, stranded in an empty galaxy, humanity gone, Earth's cities drowned in shadow and silence. Our team, stumbling along some forgotten planet, wandering like ghosts in a galaxy the Nurixi had already taken. For a heartbeat, I faltered. What if they were showing me the truth? What if Earth, the command, everything I'd been fighting for was already gone, overrun by these alien shadows? The Citadel would be nothing but a cold tomb, and outside nothing would remain but the Nurixi, drifting endlessly, the last rulers of a hollowed-out universe. Maya staggered beside me, gripping his head. They're showing me my family. They're telling me they're gone, Captain. His voice was barely a whisper. Gone, like they were never even real. I grabbed him by the shoulder, forcing him to meet my gaze. They're trying to make you give up, Maya. It's in your head. Don't let them in. My voice sounded more confident than I felt. They were pushing against every barrier I had, whispering that my resistance was pointless, that the war was already lost. My neural dampener buzzed, fighting back, but I could feel their influence seeping in, even through the defenses. We're leaving. Don't look back. My own words felt fragile, held together by the thinnest of threads, but we started moving, step by step, away from the core, each footfall a struggle against the weight of the Nuриxi's influence pressing into our minds. The Citadel trembled as the timer counted down, the charges buried deep in the core preparing for detonation. As we moved down the corridors, they twisted and blurred, walls folding into each other like images in a nightmare. The lights failed, plunging us into darkness, leaving only the dim glow of our HUDs. I could feel them in my head, images and voices melding with my thoughts, layering doubt on every decision, on every step. They showed me a vision of Earth, quiet, unbroken, but entirely devoid of life. Then they twisted it, filling it with shadowed cities and empty streets, an endless silence stretching across every corner of the planet. My own mind felt like it was slipping, like they were pulling me toward a conclusion I didn't want to face. But we pressed on, each step feeling like it carried the weight of 1,000 doubts. The Citadel's walls began to shudder violently as the timer wound down. Through the fractured static of my command was silent, an emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. For all I knew, they were already gone. Or maybe the Nurixi had jammed every frequency, cutting us off from the last threads of humanity. At last, we stumbled out of the final airlock, the Citadel's barren exterior stretching out in the silent expanse beyond. The tremors beneath our feet grew stronger, each one more violent than the last. We stood there, just outside the walls, watching as the timer's final moments ticked away. In a sudden, silent rush, the core exploded. The Citadel began to collapse in on itself, its armored walls buckling, entire sections tearing free as fire blossomed from within. It crumbled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a dark cloud against the starless void. We stood in silence, the emptiness of space around us, no words left to say. I tried to reach command one last time, but the line was dead, an empty crackle of static in my ear. For all we knew, we were the last. The Nurixi might have taken everything else, Earth, the command, whatever humanity we had left to hold on to. I turned away from the ruins of the Citadel, facing the endless dark, feeling the weight of that unknown stretching out before us. The others waited beside me, shadows against the stars, eyes reflecting the dim, dying glow of our last stronghold as it drifted away in pieces. Out here there was no map, no direction, only the distant shimmer of stars that might have been ours once but now felt as unreachable as dreams. And still there was nothing. No signal, no response, no familiar voice from command breaking through the silence. Nothing to tell us that Earth hadn't fallen long ago, that we weren't the only remnants of a war no one had survived. "Do you think there's anything left out there, sir?" Meyer asked, an echo of the uncertainty we all felt but didn't dare voice. I stared out into the black, feeling the cold press of reality closing in, and I wanted to tell him yes, that there was still something left, something worth holding on to. But I couldn't lie. Not anymore. "I don't know," I finally said. "Maybe we're all that's left. Maybe the Nurixi already took everything, and we're just the last to know." We stood there facing the darkness, a silence settling between us that felt both final and endless. In the vast expanse before us, it was as if time itself had unraveled, leaving only this uncertain moment, a fragment of humanity in a galaxy that might no longer care. So we started walking, one step at a time, into the unknown, holding on to whatever threads of defiance we had left, the ruins of the citadel behind us. We didn't know where we were going, or if there was anything left to reach. But as far as we could see, the stars were still there, faint but distant, and for now that was all we had.